I actually volunteered for this sermon. When we were deciding which sermons to do, I put my hand up and said, "Yeah, I'll do that," like an idiot, because this is an incredibly hard topic to talk about. Does God of the Old Testament, does he command and condone warfare, violence? And for me, I actually extended the title slightly, because the thing that I've always struggled with about these passages in Joshua, and actually Deuteronomy we're going to refer to as well, the thing that I've always struggled with is this isn't just warfare and violence. It's very difficult from a Western point of view to justify this. God is actually, on a surface level, it looks like he's commanding genocide, not just war. And so actually that should make us all go, hold on. This is complex. This is a big kind of piece of reasoning that we have to do here. And I thought, as I was preparing for this, and you can imagine, and to be honest with you, I've kind of wrestled with this, perhaps more than I've wrestled with any other sermon that I've delivered for you guys so far. Because this has always been an issue for me. This has always been something that I've wrestled with through my walk with God, is understanding this, because it actually matters. It has quite kind of seismic impacts. How we deal with this question affects a lot and reflects a lot about how we deal with a lot of big questions that come across us. And as I was doing this, I thought, actually, this is a bit like when I'm in my consulting room and someone comes along and they maybe have a problem that they've been struggling with for like a decade. And, they've been struggling with this thing, and they might have tried this and tried that. They've seen however many specialists or whatever, as you kind of collect opinions over time as you're struggling with a thing. And it's a little bit like when they sit down in front of me and they kind of expect me to solve the problem in 10 minutes. And actually, we're going to approach this problem, and I've got probably more like 15 to 20 minutes to deal with possibly one of the hardest apologetic questions that I think there is around. And I kind of noticed, as I reflected on that, I noticed there's an approach that seems to work in those situations with patients like that. And I thought, I wonder if that approach might be useful here. So with patients, when they've got long-standing difficult problems, often I kind of go through about 3 steps with them. They have to go with me on the journey. I can't just do it for them. But in the 3 steps are kind of like this. They go the first thing is we need to identify and clarify the actual problem. Because quite often the people that come and see me, they already know what's wrong with them. They don't need a diagnosis. Actually, what they need is to clarify and identify the actual problem. Because if I do that, then very often as we explore those problems, solutions start to present themselves. And as we explore those solutions, the second stage happens, the second step, which is that we start to make some initial progress. And that's quite a liberating moment, because sometimes people have these gnarly issues, and just making a little bit of progress is often quite transformational for them. Hope dawns. And then there's this thing that happens for some of them. So for some of those patients, they manage to make a third leap, a third step. And it's wonderful when it happens. It's actually probably my favorite bit about being a doctor, is when they make this transition. And they go from being a person who is the recipient of a disease that's happened to them, very passive. And they come to me, and they want now to receive passively a solution to that problem, right? So you start with that, and then they transform themselves into someone who is wrestling and dealing and engaging with a problem that they face. And in the process of wrestling with that problem, something really transformational happens, and they start to realize that they own their own health. They own their physical and their mental health. It's theirs, and they've got to do stuff with it. You can imagine what that then releases from them, and those are the patients that do the best, as you can imagine. And we're going to do something a bit similar today. So let's clarify and identify some actual problems that this causes, because we know that there's warfare in the Bible. We know that there's violence. Some of it doesn't cause us much of a problem, does it? We're all quite comfortable, or most of us are quite comfortable with the idea of righteous violence or righteous warfare. Most of us have many of us have kind of pacifist leaning. We'd like to be pacifists. I'd certainly like to be a pacifist. But if I see someone invading my home, I'm less of a pacifist. See, there's lots of violence that we're all quite comfortable with. So we need to identify and clarify the actual problem that this is causing. And then hopefully we'll make a little bit of progress. But then what I want to do is to go a little bit further. Because the truth is, I'm not going to give you a neatly packaged, tidy answer to the problem of warfare, violence, and genocide in the Old Testament in this sermon. Like, that's not realistic. But what I really want to do is to encourage you into that mindset shift. Maybe encourage you into leaning into the struggle, leaning into the problems. Because if we can do that, then something quite miraculous happens, doesn't it? And it changes our relationship with God. And that's what I'm hoping that we might be able to achieve. So what are the problems that it causes? So for those who are not that familiar with kind of what I'm talking about here, we're referring to the book of Joshua in particular, which records what happens when Israel as a nation has just been delivered from Egypt. They've been in Egypt for about 400 years. They crossed the Red Sea in the famous story, and then they wander around and round. And this is the moment when Joshua has taken command of the Israelites. He's succeeded Moses as the leader. And they're now about to establish their presence in an area. But the problem that they have is that the area is already controlled. It's actually controlled by deeply violent and dangerous tribes, known collectively as Canaanites. There's others as well, but collectively that's what they're known as. Archaeologically, they're possibly one of the most violent civilizations that we have records of. They did all kinds of really wicked and evil things. And one of the justifications that you'll see if you go and research stuff like this is one of the justifications is God invading this area. Actually, the Israelites taking control of this land was an act of righteous justice. So that's one of the kind of the keys to this. But that's actually not what we're focusing on today. So what's happening is that Israelites now have entered into this land. They are a ragtag tribe of nomads. They are not a powerful military force. If this was David and Goliath, they're very much David, and they're going up against military strongholds. And so what they do is they go and they take some of these military fortifications and they control land. They are able then to control an area of land, and that means then that they can establish themselves as a nation. So that's kind of the context of what's going on here. And so the first part of the problem is, well, actually, it does look like, at a casual reading, it does look like that God even commands some of the warfare. And actually, he uses language, particularly in Deuteronomy, and I'll read it to you. Apologies, I forgot to have this ready beforehand. So if we turn it, so it's in. I mean, you can follow on if you want, but it's only a couple of verses. There's a couple of different ones, and I've chosen the bit Deuteronomy 20, and this happens to be verse 16 to 18. Okay, and it says this. It says, however, in the cities of the nation, is that me making that noise? Sorry. However, in the cities of the nations, the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance. Do not leave alive anything that breathes. Completely destroy them. The Hittites, Amorites, Canaanites, Perizzites, Hivites, Jebusites, as the Lord your God has commanded you. Otherwise, they'll teach you to follow all the detestable things they do in worshipping their gods, and you will sin against the Lord your God. So there's this very clear kind of command from Deuteronomy there about not letting anything that breathes live. At a first reading, that's quite a problem for us, isn't it? Because it looks like God is commanding genocide. We go a bit further, and the second problem I think that we need to wrestle with when we come across some of these things is that a casual reading of Joshua, particularly chapters 6 through 12, which records what happens as the Israelites then encounter these different fortresses as they come across them, between those practices, over and over again, a similar phrase gets repeated. And it is that phrase. It's actually it's recalling quite clearly the command here, saying they didn't let anything that breathed survive. They didn't let any living thing continue to live. And so at a casual kind of first reading, it looks as though that's exactly what happened in Joshua. That's exactly the history that's being recorded there. And if those two things are true, if that's the case, if we're looking at a story of a God who has commanded one nation to completely and utterly destroy another, not let anything live, and we're then looking at a history where that nation's actually done that, then the problem that causes me as a follower of this God is it makes me think, well, hold on, is that a God that's consistent with the God that we see in the rest of the Bible? You know, as Christians, the reason we're doing these difficult lessons, the reason we're asking these difficult questions of the Bible is because the Bible matters to us. The Bible matters to us because we think that, although the Bible was written over maybe 5,000 years, and there's a number of different orders, maybe 100 authors, and they're written to multiple people groups across huge kind of historical kind of distances of different peoples, different cultures, different kinds of nations even. You've got this massive collection of literature, and yet we think as Christians, what we believe is that God is like the author behind the authors. He's the one that's inspiring them to write their stories. And woven through these stories, the Bible, which is really a library of smaller books, woven through those stories, we think that there is this message of God, of love, of redemption, a God who is love himself. And from his love has made creation. And the Bible is his message to that creation, telling us of the redeeming work that he wants to do, and how he loves us so much. You see, if those two issues are true, if we're actually reading scripture that sounds like God's commanding genocide, and we're actually watching that happen in the book of Joshua recorded as history, well, then we've got a problem with that third point, don't we? It's difficult then to accept that this is a loving God and a singular narrative written by an author behind the authors. So those are the problems, right? 15 minutes left? So anyway, if you dig into this a little bit further, I think there's a few observations to make, which I hope will make a little bit of progress with some of those issues, right? So the first thing is that actually God's command is not about people. It's about sovereignty. It's nothing about this is ethnic, because there are Canaanites all over the place. And actually, the command that I read to you sounds very stark. I can't read the whole chapter to you. But the command that I read to you sounds very stark, but it's actually juxtaposed against the bit just above it, which is explaining how the Israelites should leave well alone the people distant from them. If they happen to win conquest and conflict and things elsewhere, not in the land that they're going to inherit, then they have a completely different relationship with the people there. The usual spoils of war apply, rather than don't let anything breathe. So this is a very special command for a very specific area, and it's not about ethnicity. It's about control, and it's about land. It's about sovereignty. Because God is trying to do a very specific thing here. He's establishing a new nation state. He's establishing the state of Israel, really, as a way of establishing all kinds of customs and laws, because Israel have to be allowed to develop their own culture, to develop their laws, to develop their traditions and things that then uphold all kinds of things that we benefit from today. Actually, all sorts of things are first recorded in that Israelite nation. That first nation is the first nation ever to put in history the idea that people have individual value that needs protecting. It's the first nation ever to have the idea that people have intrinsic value. And that means then that we should have a society that protects the weaker. That's the first time that idea appears in human history. And so there's things like that have to be given time and space to develop. So you kind of get the idea that this is about creating holiness. So Jericho is just about one of the first cities that they come across. And as Joshua is approaching Jericho, the bit that we read just at the beginning happens. Joshua meets the commanders of the armies of the Lord. And an interesting conversation happens, doesn't it? He says, are you for us or against us? And he says, neither. Well, that's interesting. So the second point here, so that's the first point, is actually God commanding genocide. And I would argue that, no, he's not. He's not actually commanding genocide. Actually, what's happening here is he's commanding purity. What he's saying is that you do not inherit any of the culture of the land that you're taking. You need to create your own kind of piece of land. And that's a very specific command for a specific time. But I don't think that it amounts to genocide, because there's absolutely no command at all that if they flee, that they should be pursued. There's no command whatsoever. The second thing is that the casual reading makes it look like the author of Joshua has actually recorded the same thing. He's actually recorded genocide, because that phrase is repeated over and over again about not letting anything live and breathe. And actually, and that's what it looks like on the surface. But I think there's a really important nuance to take here. So the first thing is that it's a matter of literary genre. So when we're looking at these literary genres, so the Bible is, as I mentioned, is made up of many literary genres over thousands of years, right? So we look at parts of Genesis, and we conclude that some of that is quite poetic language. We look at parts of other bits, like the Gospels particularly. We say, actually, no, this is historical narrative. In those parts, the detail of the story is what's important. In Joshua, it's a mixture of different genres. In particular, there's quite a lot of war talk. There's quite a lot of rhetoric that mirrors similar kind of descriptions of battles and wars written by other cultures and other societies at the time. A lot of the language is shared between them. The styles of writing are quite similar. So when you look closely at Joshua, it turns out that quite a lot of what's being said is a little bit like kind of war rhetoric. They're describing, they're over-explaining the victories that they've had. It's a little bit like when we go to a football match or a rugby match or something like that, and one team wins decisively, they say they slaughtered the opposition. So there's an element of that going on. We don't expect them to have actually killed all the opposition. They just won the game decisively. The same is being delivered here in a similar way. They're saying this was a really decisive battle, and actually we won it absolutely with purity, and we didn't take any of these things home as spoils for ourselves. And that's part of the not adopting anything that's here. And I was a bit skeptical of that as I first started reading the argument. But actually, if you look more closely at other bits of Joshua, so for example, there's a list of cities that have this treatment applied to them that are taken as you go through Joshua 6 through 12, more or less. As you get to Joshua 13, there's then a list of cities and areas where there are plenty of Canaanites. And the question is, who shall defend us against them? Because Joshua has now got on in years, and he's coming to the end of his reign. And so the question is, well, who is now going to go up against them and defend us? And then it lists quite a long list of things that we've only just been told have been absolutely and completely destroyed. So there's the author of the book of Joshua doesn't necessarily expect us to have understood to begin with that all of them were wiped out. He doesn't expect that, because as you then move through the book, he contradicts himself quite plainly and says, no, there's plenty of people there still. So we have to take a slightly more nuanced approach to how we interpret some of that language, some of that war rhetoric. The last point that it's worth making is thinking a little bit about the bigger picture, the wider narrative. Looking at Joshua and trying to draw conclusions about the kind of God that's being portrayed in Joshua, if you just look at that alone, is a little bit like looking at a Star Wars film and only watching the bit where Luke drops the proton torpedo into the Death Star and destroys the thing. And then there's these cutscenes where all the Imperial troops are getting blown up and dying and stuff like that. And if you only watch that clip of the film, you might come to the conclusion that the Rebel Alliance were the baddies and that Luke Skywalker was the super baddie and he's destroyed everybody. You would miss the point of the story. But the point of the story is that's the fulcrum of the struggle. That's the point at which the world turns on its axis in that part of the story. And this point here is one of those moments in history where the world has turned on its axis, where history turns on its axis. That's why, and there's a couple of moments where our attention is drawn to history turning on its axis. And often, I noticed, it's often got something that we often highlighted to it because they say that the ground is holy. And there often is an instruction to take off your shoes, for this is holy ground. So it happens, for example, when Moses, you might know the story, when Moses he's actually walking on by because he's trying to attend sheep, and then he sees this burning bush. He approaches it, the voice comes out, and what does it say? Take off your shoes, this is holy ground. History is turning on its axis. The same thing happens here, this mysterious encounter with the commander of the armies of the Lord. Take off your shoes, this is holy ground. History is turning on its axis here. A new nation is starting, a new way of thinking about human rights, about liberty, a whole new thing, a paradigm is happening. I noticed, as I was thinking this, what came to mind was another occasion I can think of when shoes get mentioned. And I think it's really cool, actually. See if you like it. When Jesus was being baptized, what does John say to him? I'm not fit to untie your sandals. Jesus has taken off his shoes because that was holy ground. The moment that Jesus got baptized and began his ministry, history spun on its axis again. You see, the Bible draws our attention to these moments quite a lot. Anyway, so we've looked at a couple of the problems. We've started to explore a few solutions, and I realize that I can't give you a complete answer. If I tried to completely answer all of these, we'd be here all day. But there are quite conclusive answers. You can get into it academically quite a bit. So we've talked about It looks like God's commanding genocide, but actually if you look at it more carefully, it's not about genocide. It's actually about creating a protected culture. We've talked a little bit about how the book of Joshua seems to narrate a history of similar sort of things, but actually what's going on there is people aren't all just being killed. Actually, what's happening is they clearly are lots of survivors. So there's nuance there in how you interpret that and what's really being meant by the not letting anything breathe. It's a different thing. There's a concept that I don't really have a lot of time to go into called herem. And this is the word in Hebrew that's the command that's been given to herem. And it means to devote to destruction, to remove, to obliterate. And actually it's probably being applied here, not necessarily to individuals or people, but actually probably to cultures and traditions and ways of doing things. For example, what would be absolutely right would be to herem and completely destroy the Canaanite practice of taking small children and putting them in essentially a statue that is cast as an oven and burning it alive over a fire. That was a common practice that they would do. So that is clearly a kind of culture, and we would say absolutely just totally destroy that culture. And so at some point we have to create space for a new way of thinking about the vulnerable and the weak to develop. Okay. The third kind of problem, the last thing I wanted to mention about the historical narrative as well, is as you work through the book of Joshua, it makes it sound, because it says the city of Jericho, for example, everyone in the city of Jericho is destroyed, and it is devoted to destruction, using this word herem. And we think, when we read cities, because of the fact that we're Western, because of the culture that we live in, because of what we understand a city to be, we think that's a large population centre with hundreds of thousands of people in it. Most of them are civilians, and this is an awful thing to have happened for that thing to be destroyed. But it's actually much more likely that Jericho was a military fort. It was a fortification, probably occupied by only 100 to 200 people, almost all of whom will have been part of the military fortifications there. Actually, towns or cities like Jericho were more about controlling land in a society like that, an entirely nomadic arable sort of society. So people didn't really live in big population centres. Actually, fortifications were there for controlling people and ensuring that the people in the lands surrounding it were controlled by the customs and laws that whoever was in charge of the fort wanted to enforce, whichever tribe happened to have control of that at the time. And so when you destroy those forts, you're actually liberating the people all around it from the influence of the fort. So it's quite a different narrative when you sort of look at that. So we're not thinking of large cities. And that shift in scale, for me, changes quite a lot about the ethics of what's going on here, what we're actually reading about. So, looking at those two problems, or the problems that we've got, we said at the beginning that if those were true, if it looks like God is really commanding genocide, and if it looks like genocide is really happening and being glorified and recorded, then it causes us a problem, doesn't it? Because it deconstructs our idea that God is a good and loving God and that there's a God that is behind all of the books of the Bible. Hopefully, I've given you enough of an introduction to kind of some of the debates and topics and arguments around this to say, actually, it's not as simple as that. It doesn't look like those are the case. And actually, when we come to turn to that third problem, I think that the God that needs to be deconstructed here is the one who happens to fit into our neat worldview. See, the reality is that God is much bigger than us. Faith, an authentic faith, is not about having a tidy, neat worldview, having a theology that's packaged, that we can understand, that's easy for us, a safe place that we can go to when the world seems chaotic. That's not really what authentic faith is all about. Authentic faith is all about stepping into a relationship with a God who is beyond us, who we can't control, who is bigger than us, who doesn't obey our ideas, who actually we have to wrestle with. The last thing I wanted to leave you with, really, was the thought about the character Jacob. Does everyone remember the character Jacob? He's the guy whose name got changed to Israel. And he was in the process of trying to reconcile with his brother. He sent all his stuff ahead of him. And he meets this character in the middle of the night. And he wrestles with him. And this weird thing happens. Jacob just keeps wrestling this character. He won't let go. And the character wrestles, and Jacob can't overcome him. And they're wrestling and wrestling. They get to, and the light dawns. And this character says, you've got to let me go. And Jacob holds the character. And he says, I will not let you go until you bless me. And I think that, and as that story develops, that's the moment when it becomes apparent that Jacob hasn't just been wrestling with a person, he's been wrestling with God himself in a personified form. And God touches his hip and gives him a limp, and he changes his name. And he says, for this is the moment where you wrestled with God and weren't overcome. And there are things in all of our lives. For me, it's questions like this sometimes. There are other questions as well that we all need to struggle with. There's all sorts of stuff in the Bible, theologies in the Bible that will feel difficult to us, that we have to wrestle with. There's issues, in our current culture, there's all kinds of issues about freedom, about sexuality, about identity. There's issues about leadership. There's issues, all sorts of things like that we have to struggle with. But rather than there being really easy off-pat answers, authentic faith is about approaching God and grabbing hold of him in that moment and not letting go and saying, I will not let you go until you bless me. And we've talked mostly about theological things, but actually I kind of want to bring this a little bit more closer to each of our hearts. And I guess this is similar to that mindset shift that I mentioned earlier. A few years ago, I was looking after a young child in a hospital setting. And I diagnosed her with just a simple upper respiratory tract infection. She seemed all right. All the measurements were in the normal range, so we let them go home. And in the early hours of the next morning, they came back in again as a crash call. And we had to try to resuscitate this child, and we failed. And the child died. And for months afterwards, I was furious with God. I held God responsible because I had been examining this child and he could have said something to me. He could have whispered, he could have troubled me about sending this kid home, right? It would have been so easy to intervene and change that. And it didn't happen that way. Mum lost her child. And to this day, I'm not sure I have a clear answer to that. It's not easy. There are other situations as well, isn't there? Many of us have walked through pain here. Many of us have walked through moments of difficulty and confusion. I think of the fact that he let Sarah die. And that troubles me, right? It troubles all of us, doesn't it? And we might have we might have satisfying answers. We might have good theological answers to that. But that doesn't always deal with the answer here. It doesn't deal with the question, can I really trust God? A couple of years ago, I went to the front to get prayed for my gout, which I'm limping around with today. And clearly, God hasn't cured that. That doesn't mean that he's not there and he doesn't care. It just means that I need to wrestle with him some more. It means that actually my faith is not a place where I know the answers necessarily. My faith is a place where I go to wrestle with God. It's a place where I go to meet with God in those difficult moments. And I know that today, even amongst just a few of us here, right, I know that there'll be some people who have some intellectual struggles, who kind of think, yeah, actually, I want to trust God, but I'm struggling with this issue, and I don't know how to get past this particular issue. There'll be some of us who are struggling with trust, who are struggling, like, can I really trust God? The last couple of years have been pretty bad for me in terms of career, right? And I've sought to serve God in all of these different ways, and I've sought to serve God in the career, and kind of done the things that I hoped would be the sorts of things that God would bless, and yet that hasn't happened. And so I'm left with, do you trust God still? What happens next? See, we don't believe necessarily in a safe God who gives us an easy answer to questions. We believe in a God who we must wrestle with, who teaches us, who often leaves us with a limp. And you'll all have similar stories of kind of where you've hoped for things, where things haven't happened. And I guess the point that we're landing on here is that the trouble with us, the trouble starts when we try to make God fit our understanding, when we invent a God that fits our worldview and our understanding. If you want a recipe for how to have a crisis of faith, the recipe is that you have to believe in a God that fits your understanding first. Because then, when things go wrong in your life, or when you come across a question you can't answer, then that God dissolves, doesn't it? Because he's already fit your worldview, and things happen in our life that cause us to have to shift the way that we see the world. We need a God that's bigger than that. There's a danger that you could misunderstand what I'm saying and think that I'm saying that you need to turn off your brain to believe in God. That's not what I'm saying at all. Okay. When you push into this stuff, when you wrestle with God, he does bless you. When you grab hold of him like Jacob did, and you say, I will not let go of you in this moment until you bless me, he does actually bless you. As I've wrestled with this subject, and I've not given you a full answer today, but as I've wrestled with this and thought about this and rewritten the sermon 5 or 6 times, as I've wrestled with this, God has blessed me. I know, I'm satisfied in my own heart that I know that there isn't a God that's commanding genocide. I've understood this. I've got my head around it. And there might be issues for you to wrestle with too. And if you keep hold of him, he will bless you. It's not the case that you have to turn off your mind to difficult stuff. Actually, I'm saying lean into the difficult stuff. But don't be put off by the fact that it's difficult. The point is that it doesn't come easy, that the answers aren't necessarily there on a plate for us, and we have to lean into them to be blessed by God. So, as I close, I wanted to give you guys an opportunity maybe to pray. We're about to have a reflective moment and do communion. And I just wanted to give you guys a moment to pray and think. Is there issues that you need to wrestle with God about? Is there stuff that we're carrying in our heart that are there moments where we've been disappointed by God? Are there intellectual issues where we're struggling with God? Are there, whatever it is, are we willing? Because it takes courage to wrestle with God. Because as you go into this, you don't actually know what the outcome's going to be. Are we willing to take the courage to step into that wrestle? And it doesn't happen in a moment necessarily, in fact, very rarely. Usually it's a thing that plays out over time. And often it plays out best with other people. So just take a moment now. Let's have a moment to pray, and I'll pray to close. But what I want to do is just to invite you into that place. Father God, thank you that I can trust you, that you are a real God rather than a figment of my imagination. It's tough sometimes because that often means that I don't understand at first. Lord, I pray that you would meet with us today. I pray that you would encourage us to step forward into a deeper relationship with you, that we would grab hold of you and not let go. Father God, I pray that for anyone here who is struggling with you, struggling with stuff in their life, struggling with ideas and beliefs, Lord, I pray that you would encourage them to lean into that, to meet you in that place. Amen.